Welcome to Chapter 8 of our text, Database Administration. This is for CIS 307, a part of the Iowa Community College online consortium. This chapter goes over the role of a database administrator and starts off with a figure 8-1 on page 257 and kind of summarizes what some of the database administrator responsibilities are. In the area of database policy formulation and enforcement, it discusses access privileges, security, disaster planning, and archiving. In the area of other database administrative functions, this chapter will go over DBMS evaluations and selection, DBMS maintenance, data dictionary management, and training. And in the area of database technical functions, this chapter will discuss the DBA's role in database design, testing, and performance tuning. So we'll start off in the areas of database formulation and enforcement. And there's really four areas that fall into this category: the access, the security, the disaster planning, and the archiving. So we'll start with the access privileges. Every user does not need to have access to every table, nor even every field in every table. So it's the responsibility of the database administrator to figure out each user's role within the company and what parts of the database that user does or does not need access to. And remember, even once you have access, you might have read rights or write rights. The function or the statement that we've used in SQL was the grant statement to grant these different rights to people. Usually the database administrator will put in wide policies of areas of people. They'll set up groups of people that, maybe customer sales reps should have access to these tables, fields, screens, etc. And then even within those, what fields they have read-only rights to and what fields they have write rights to, that they can actually change the data. Sometimes we might even have users who can add records, but they can't edit. We might have others who can edit, but they can't add. So we really can get down to a lot of different types of privileges that the database administrator manages. So when you have hundreds of users, you obviously put these users into groups and security classification groups, and you assign different security classes to different users. The way you assign it, you have to be flexible. Generally in a large database, what I would see would be not only groups of users, but also then even the different screens are classified so that you might take different classifications. Maybe 3 classifications would go to one group of users, maybe one classification would go to a different group of users, but maybe there's one user within that group who has access to a second classification. So you classified not only the people, but also their rights within. The text gives 2 examples here on page 258-259 in figure 8.2. In this scenario, Sam is an employee and his main responsibility is inventory control. So what they're trying to show you with this diagram is that Sam would need then to have access to all of the parts that are in the warehouse, what's in the warehouse, how many, the quantity, maybe even some of the costs and the sales prices of everything with those parts. But Sam would have no need to have, for example, the sales rep's home address information. Or for that matter, he may not even need to know what territory that sales rep represents. So it's the database administrator's responsibility to work within the database management system and determine Sam's security rights to the various tables. On page 259, they give another example, and this is a Paige is her responsibility is to do customer mailings. Maybe she works in marketing, and so she needs access to all of the customers' names, addresses. She might need access to some of their order information. For example, she might want to, if they ordered a particular nut or bolt or screw or nail or whatever the part is, and she wants to now send some type of a sales flyer to just that type of customer, then Paige may need access to some of the order information, but does she really need access to their balance? Probably not. Um, Now you might sit there and go, well, she wouldn't want to mail it to people who are over their credit limit or things like that. So she might need access to the list has already been filtered down for her to that set, but she doesn't actually need to see the specific numbers behind it. So it's just a couple of different examples of permissions. They give another one on page 260 with Valerie. In this situation, Valerie is a sales representative, and what they're trying to show you is that she would be given a lot of data on the customers that she represents, but does she really need to have the data on other customers? An example of this within a setting that you might all understand would be, an advisor. An advisor in a school setting would certainly need a lot of information, probably full access to not only, home addresses, telephone numbers, email addresses, grades, program majors, high school information, transcripts from other institutions, etc., on any particular student. But the advisor really only needs that on the students that he or she is advising. There's no need for that advisor to have access to that data for students that he or she is not serving as the advisor for. So in this third scenario on page 260, they're giving the access by row rather than by table or by field. So you have to look at it from a variety of different angles. The second item that falls under database policy formulation and enforcement is security. And you might at first think that access and security, they're very close to each other, but there is just a slight difference. Access is the database administrator actually saying you have access to this and you don't have access to this. But security now is my making sure that I'm preventing that unauthorized access. What's important to understand is that would include both intentional and accidental unauthorized access. And I'll give you a personal example for that. As you should have figured out by now, I am the institutional researcher for Eastern Iowa Community Colleges in my day job. So I do all of our state and federal reporting, and I research everything within the college. So I actually have access within my role, my job, to not all, but nearly all data with both in human resources, in billing, accounts receivable, accounts payable, as well as credit and non-credit students, faculty, etc. However, I have read-only rights because I don't ever want to accidentally lean on a screen and end up changing something within that database. So I'm authorized to view data, but there are very little areas that I am authorized to actually change data. So some of the ways that you might use security that we've already discussed, again, the grant statement in SQL could come into play. We also, in an earlier chapter, discussed views, how we would change views of data, and that can be both to make it simpler for the user, might be one reason that we use views, maybe combining fields from multiple tables into one view to make it easier for the user to understand the data. But I also might use views because maybe there is a particular field like Social Security number that somebody isn't allowed to see, so I may use a view where I've filtered that out. It's the job of the database administrator to determine the access for each user. Again, just like with the privileges, it is not the DBA's job to actually make the final decision. The database administrator determines the access for each user or a group of users and recommends security policies and procedures. But top-level management approves these in the same way that top-level management approves the access privileges. It is, however, the role of the database administrator to communicate those policies to all users, to all mid-level management, and to all end users. When there is a security violation, it is the responsibility of the database administrator to coordinate that investigation of that security violation. Now, often in a large company, even already that you can see there's so much put on the database administrator. So keep in mind, he or she is going to have people who work under them, but they ultimately are the one who's coordinating that investigation. The third database policy formulation and enforcement is disaster planning. And this would include damage through physical incident, such as some type of a hardware malfunction, any type of a virus or worm that might get in, any type of a power outage, any type of a natural disaster like hurricane, fire. So some of the things that would be included in that disaster plan would be of something that absolutely could happen, a hard drive failure, some type of any hardware failure. And so the database administrator is responsible to ultimately know that there is a plan in place. What happens if the server goes down? What steps do we go through both in the short run? Maybe it's something simple, we just have to get it back up online. Maybe it is something a little more major, like there's been a complete hard drive failure. What type of steps are in place to guarantee that our users have as little time down in that database as possible? One thing that you look at is redundant array of inexpensive independent drives, known as RAID. Basically, this is, making sure that your database is actually running in multiple places. A good example of this would be, every time you go to the mall and you use a Visa or a MasterCard, that transaction is actually run on many, many miles apart. I believe one's on the East Coast and one's on the West Coast, because the odds that the East Coast would get hit by a hurricane at the same time the West Coast got hit by a earthquake are very slim. So they've made them very far apart, but it's redundant in that it's happening at both locations simultaneously. Another thing to think about is something as minor as a power outage. Now, obviously, if there's a power outage, your users do tend to understand that, but not if they are remotely located. For example, again, using our own database system here at the college, our servers are located in one physical building, but our users would be located in Clinton, Iowa, Muscatine, Iowa, Columbus Junction, Iowa, Maquoketa, Iowa, all throughout Scott, Clinton, and Muscatine counties and beyond. So with that in mind, what if I'm sitting in Muscatine, I haven't lost power, but where the city that the servers are in has lost power. So I may not even be aware of it, and now you have no way to communicate it to me because where the servers are, you've lost power. So that's one thing, is what are going to be some of your backup communication routes so that people know what is going on. You can't assume that just because you've lost power, everybody knows it, because they don't. And then what types of things are in place so that we can ensure as smooth of a shutdown as possible, or even maintaining it. Do we have universal power supplies in place? Do we have generators in place? And even within that, when it comes to something like the generator, which outlets are on the generator? Usually you have key users who have the special electrical lines for access through the generator, but not every user does. So again, that's all part of that disaster planning. And then finally, of course, your backup systems. And so here we're talking not only about doing routine backups of the data and pulling that data off on at least a nightly basis, but we're also talking about where that data is stored. I always joke when I would talk to home users, and they would routinely back up to some type of a diskette, a compact CD or a DVD, or heaven forbid, even older, back on floppy disks. And I would say, well, where do you keep your backup? And they'd keep it right there in the CD drive. And of course, I always said, well, because you know that when the burglar comes in and steals your computer, they're going to have the common courtesy to remove the CD from the drive. But, it seems so silly when I say it, but reality is a lot of people, companies I've been to, do keep their backups like in the same place. I remember years ago, and we're talking years ago, when I had a friend who was in charge of tape backup at a company, And part of his job, he went in, they had 3 shifts a day. Somebody went in, and as part of their job, they ran all of the tape backups. And it was in their job hiring that they then, when they left, had to take the tape and place it into the trunk of their car so that it was off site. And it was a requirement of their job to do so. The theory was that if something happened with the main system, that somewhere in town was somebody with an 8-hour-old copy and somebody else with a 16-hour-old copy and somewhere else a 24-hour-old copy. So, I mean, that's not the most sophisticated backup system in the world, but you know what? It worked for that smaller company. They managed to keep it off site so that if a fire did break out, they would not lose their backups as well. And it's ultimately the responsibility of the database administrator to have plans in place for all of these types of things. And finally, the fourth one under database policy formulation and enforcement is archiving. Now, by removing the data that you don't require on a regular basis, you can increase both your processing time and decrease your disk storage. But yet you have to determine what data can be archived, how that data is archived, and how we will still maintain access to the archived data. Another big thing to think about these days is the legal compliance. And in your chapter on page 262 at the bottom of the page, they list a number of federal acts that really do control both what you need to have, how data is stored, as well as how the data is archived and how quickly you have to be able to get back into that data. Anybody who plans any type of a career in database administration is going to need to, at the very least, have a basic understanding of all of these laws. And then, of course, depending upon what industry you end up with working in, for some of these laws may need to have a very detailed understanding of the legal complexities when it comes to data. Just some examples are the CIS Act, the Patriot Act, some various Department of Defense rules, presidential acts that they give you a summary again there on page 262 of some of the laws that they feel are the most important. That takes us to the second overall category for a database administrator, which is other database administrative functions. And the first one that they talk about here is what a database administrator goes through when they're actually going to evaluate and select, be it the initial or be it a new database management system. There is an enormous number of considerations, things that have to be considered when you're evaluating and selecting that database management system. And they list them off. They give you in figure 8 on pages 264 and 265. They give it to you in a checklist format, but then on pages 266 and 267, they really delve into each of these areas. You can read, so I'm not going to go read over every one of these, but you really don't initially think of all the considerations when evaluating a database. So it's important that you have somebody, they're probably leading this team. I'm going to have input from my users as well, but a user isn't going to think of things like, well, what procedural and non-procedural languages can access the data. What can I use SQL? Can I dump it out to Excel? Can I rewrite scripts using C++? Or do I need to use something else? What type of documentation is the vendor supplying me for the database? What's the most people think of things like cost, but does everybody think about support from the company or portability or what security is already built into the system? So there's a wide variety of considerations when evaluating and selecting a database management system, and the database administrator would be the one leading that team. Then once it's in place, it's the job of the database administrator, of course, to do that installation. Now, at first you think, well, would you even have a database administrator if it's a brand new database? But more commonly, you're going to be replacing some type of a database system for a variety of reasons. But so the database administrator is going to oversee the installation of the new system, and then ultimately, once it's installed, is going to be the person who has primary responsibility for all the maintenance functions. So if it's an in-house system, it's their job to keep track of the various versions and to have some type of versioning software, probably some type of check-in and check-out, so that if one programmer is working on an area, another programmer can't write some code to that area, and then when these two end up conflicting, as well as managing, if it's a vendor supplied system, managing all of the various updates that would come in to the system. Any type of debugging that has to happen, any type of testing, which we'll get into in a little bit, that has to happen. That's all maintenance, coordinating all of that. And ultimately, the DBA is most likely also responsible for all types of vendor relations if it is a purchased database product. Another database administrative function would be the management of the database dictionary. We discussed in Chapter 7 the catalog. That's a huge part of the data dictionary, but most likely the database administrator has additional information about tables, fields, indexes, etc. And also, it is the role of the database administrator to determine how all of these various tables, queries, etc. are going to be named, what type of naming conventions are going to be put into place, even down to the point of defining exactly what data goes into a particular field and what that actually means. Some examples might be, if we were to run a particular report, is it going to show what was ordered or only what was ordered and shipped as being ordered? Maybe only what was ordered and paid for. So as we have users who are out there and they want to request various types of reports and queries, some type of data definitions have to be established so that the user can request it in the particular manner that they get what they're actually looking for. It's the database administrator's responsibility to make sure that all users are trained. Again, in a large company, they probably are not actually going out doing any training, but they're coordinating other people underneath them. But it is ultimately their responsibility to make sure that all users have been trained in their particular screens and area. And you shouldn't do it just as a click here, click there. The user needs to have some minor understanding of the underlying table or tables that their data is actually going into. And usually the DBA coordinates the not only the physical training or any delivery of online, whatever delivery of training, but also actually writes all those training materials, sets some type of schedule as to how often users need to be retrained, keeps track of changes within the new versions, may cause retraining in certain areas. Again, that would all fall onto the database administrator. And then the third broad area that would fall underneath the database administrator would be the database technical functions. And we've talked about some of these before also. Database design was discussed at length in Chapter 6. But it's the responsibility of the database administrator to ultimately ensure that all of the programmers follow the database design and to determine what type of documentation is going to be required. And we're talking here about the behind the scenes documentation. If one of my users needs to make changes to tables or views, how are they going to document it? How are they going to determine the old view versus the new view, and continue to do a constant review of the database design, because a database is going to change. You don't design it all on paper and then that's it. Nobody adds a field, nobody changes a field, no definition changes. That's just not the way it works. Data definitions are changing all the time. When we originally thought that the warehouse number was going to be a number, next thing you know, they build a warehouse and they've named it, 3A, And now suddenly you have to change the definition of that field to accommodate the alphabet character that's been added. So, I mean, these types of things happen all the time. So the database administrator needs to be constantly reviewing and re-reviewing the database design and making changes as necessary to accommodate the current users. One of the ways they're going to do that is through some type of a testing environment. So the database administrator is going to maintain not only the production environment, but a test environment. So sometimes you'll refer to the test environment as a development environment or as a test environment. The production environment you'll refer to as either production or live. Generally, programmers don't have access to the live environment. They do all of their recoding in the test environment. And then you have key users who are experts in their area that would actually log into the test environment to test how the data is working within that environment with the changes that programmer made to that area. Same thing will happen when a new version comes out from the vendor. That new version, maybe it's changed a couple of screens, that new version is going to be installed into the test environment. Key users are going to log in and test the data to see if it is still storing crop properly, is it still allowing edits properly, or is it, just overall working? Are there any reports or views that are broken as a result of this? That's all going to happen in test. And then once it's determined that the new programming changes are acceptable, it's the responsibility of the database administrator to transfer those that code from the test environment over to the live environment. Now, your textbook does discuss both of these environments here on page 269, but I want to mention that in large companies, there's generally a third environment, which is a training environment. It is very rare that I would ever train a user in a live environment. So it's very possible that I'm maintaining not only my production or live database, but that I'm also maintaining 2 or more test and training environments on top of that. And then ultimately, through both that constant reevaluation of the database design and constant testing of changes, that database administrator is also going to do performance tuning. And performance tuning basically means that I'm looking at the data and the design of the data, and I'm constantly reevaluating. For example, should an index be added? Will that make some of the querying happen faster? Should an index be removed? Maybe there's one that was put there, but we really don't use it much anymore, so I'm going to go ahead and remove it because that's going to speed up my overall database. So it's just constantly analyzing the database and looking for the highest performance possible by tuning that design. Now, before I end this, the text goes on then and talks a little bit about doing some redesigning of tables, but I want to give you an example that I think you can understand. As I told you before, I do all the reporting here at the colleges, and when I started here a few years ago, we had to store a race as required by the federal government, and each student could have one race. So we had, your typical white, black. The federal government determined what the race categories were. And then we ultimately had one called other, for those people who didn't feel that they fit into any of those race categories. And in about 2009, the federal government decided that they were going to change their race categories and ethnicity categories. They actually split it off. Hispanic is no longer a race, it is an ethnicity. So if you notice today, you're commonly going to be asked things like, are you Hispanic Latino? Yes or no. And then the next question will be, please select, or what is your race? And it'll say, select all that apply. So now we went from a database for our students and employees that was storing a single numeric value connected to one of the race lookups to needing two fields, one for ethnicity, that was a yes no field, and then suddenly we had opened up the ability to select multiple races. That's a good example of where a federal law changed, and as a result, we had to do a ton of programming to the database in order to accommodate the new data definition. It'd be the role of the database administrator to oversee the old versus the new. And of course, then you're hit with that challenge, that extra challenge of how do I now determine, because the category of other was now gone. So how am I going to gather that information for the students who had previously categorized themselves as other? And in the future, how am I going to gather that information? Now, while the database administrator is not going to be the one gathering the information, he or she's going to play a key role in the forms and processes that are put in place in order to gather that information. So again, there's just a lot of testing and design work that had to be redone because an outside agency, the federal government, changed the rules. So the database administrator has a ton of various things, various job duties that while they may not be the one who are actually doing it, they are the one who's ultimately responsible for all of these areas.